Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So, welcome to our Graduate School of Social Work lecture series. We're really pleased that you were able to come, and we're very pleased to have Suzanne Kerns, it is Kerns, yeah, I always went Kerns. Suzanne from the University of Washington here to speak with us today. Let me just at least a couple of things. Suzanne is a professor?
Associate.
Associate? Oh.
As of July 1st.
Oh,
yeah.
So, you need to update your CV.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
So, an associate professor at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine, where she's been doing this work at least at that department, maybe even before then, but at least since 2008. She's done a large amount of her scholarship in the whole area of evidence-based practice with the focus on child welfare, youth, and adolescent, and juvenile justice, and so wonderful areas in doing this type of work. Excuse me, she's been funded for her work from the Administration of Family and Children's. She's also had funding from Washington State there, as well as from NIH. So we're really pleased. She's kicking off this year. This is the first lecture in our GSS lecture series. So we welcome Suzanne.
Thank you. Okay. I'm connected to like 14 different things, so hold on just a second. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Wonderful. I am really glad to be here today and be in the beautiful state of Colorado. And I get to talk with you today about some of the work that I've been doing in Washington State around implementation of evidence-based practices for children's mental health. And a friend of mine sent me a book a couple weeks ago that Tony Biglin recently wrote, and I just wanted to start off the lecture with a quote that struck me on page 11 in his book, The Nurture Effect, where he writes, "Truly transforming societies so they ensure nearly everyone's well-being requires a perspective beyond attention to individuals, families, schools, and peer groups. We have to translate this knowledge into benefits for entire populations." I thought this was a really powerful quote that captures the essence of a lot of the work that I try to do in my professional life, and thinking, how do we actually translate research and science into practice in a meaningful way, not just to get it out to one or two privileged families who are able to receive the benefit of the interventions that are being delivered, but actually to entire communities and have that population effect, move the needle on some of these indicators of child abuse and neglect and child maltreatment and coercive parenting that we know are just really challenges that many of our young people face. This picture is Washington State. This is the beautiful Methow Valley. I just wanted to have a little picture of home as I started this.
This was before the fire?
This was before the fires. It was, yeah. Actually, the fires, if you look out to that peak kind of far in the distance, that's pretty much was burned this summer. Which is not how I wanted to start out the lecture talking about, but it's okay. So I wanted to just share with you all, I'm not sure how familiar folks are with the definition of evidence-based practices that we have in Washington State. There's a lot of debate out in the field, both in the research field and in the policy field, about what actually constitutes evidence-based practices. So I wanted to just take a moment to share with you what we've done in Washington State. A couple of years ago in 2012, we had House Bill 2536 get passed, which means not as much to you all as it did to us, because that House bill said, you know, for our public serving agencies in child welfare, in juvenile justice, and in mental health, we want to increase the amount of evidence-based services that are available to our young people. But in order to realize that vision, we actually had to start at a pretty fundamental place to go back and do some definitional work on what it means to have evidence-based practices. So we kept some of the science in there that the research says is important for a definition of evidence-based practices as far as having randomized or statistically controlled evaluations, but we wanted to open that up just a little bit. And so we said, even if it's one evaluation, but it's multi-site and it's large, that we would include that, because a lot of times there's more children and families that participate in those studies than there are in many RCTs combined. So, so we added that. And so that broadened our definition a little and made a few more programs eligible to meet the definition. But then we did a couple of things that actually made the definition smaller. And this is not necessarily as much in response to science as thinking about the impact of these definitions on public policy. And so we thought, you know, there are some studies that have shown that these programs have good effects over time, and there's other studies that show that those effects drop off over time. So we make sure that we were only including studies that meet that definition that have been able to demonstrate sustained effects. But the two things that I think are really unique about what Washington did is we added two other stipulations. If we're really going to get behind evidence-based practices in our state, then we wanted to make sure we were being responsive to the concerns that the field has that sometimes these programs are not researched on or maybe viewed as applicable to a range of different diverse populations. Now, some may argue, myself included, that this doesn't go maybe quite far enough with the definition, but we said at the very least we would want to make sure that we have a non-Caucasian population of folks involved in the research that at least matches on a proportional level the percent of non-white individuals in Washington State, which happens in Washington State to be 32%. So we used that as our benchmark. We said we have to have inclusion of diverse populations at least that rate for a study to be included. And then, has anyone heard of the Washington State Institute for Public Policy? I see a few hands going up. So they're pretty well regarded. They've been our partners in this definitional work. They're really, I think, internationally regarded for their work that they've done on cost benefit. And so the final piece that we added into our definition is if we're going to use this to inform policy, we better make sure that these programs are actually cost beneficial, that if we invest in evidence-based practices, we're going to get a return on our investment. And so they had to meet, I think, an 85% likelihood of being cost beneficial to be able to get into our category of evidence-based. So that shrunk our pool pretty quickly. The other thing, not to zero though, there were a few that were in there, it wasn't zero, but it got smaller. The other concern that's out there right around evidence-based practices is that if you have legislation that mandates evidence-based practices, that it can stall innovation, right? And that practices that are available in the community that perhaps are really powerful, important interventions that people have developed, but maybe haven't had the resource to conduct the research, they get to be losers in the game, right? Because then all of a sudden they're not able to be supported in the same way. And we didn't want to have that. We didn't want to have a situation where things would be stalled because they had to meet a very rigorous definition. So we created two other categories of research-based and promising practices. I'm not going to go in the interest of time into great detail about how we came up with all of the definitions with it, but I think I just wanted to highlight the illustration and just let you know this is the definitional framework I'm working off of throughout the rest of the talk today. Are there any questions about this? Okay, great. The other part I wanted to introduce before I talk about a couple of the projects that I'm doing is a paper that we just got accepted for publication in Psychiatric Services with my colleague Eric Bruns and some others. And if you look at the growth in literature on evidence-based practices over the past 15 years, you can see a pretty exponential growth. This is just a search in PsycInfo and in Medline for evidence-based practices. This is what will pop up, the number of publications each year. It's huge. But what we did is we looked at the National Research Institute collects data from every state across the entire country and ask questions about how much they're implementing evidence-based practices. And they've been collecting this information actually since 1993. We just started though with 2001 because that's when they started asking questions that more consistently, and also when the growth of evidence-based practice research started. And so I just wanted to overlay a little chart that graph that we compiled around multisystemic therapy. Have people heard of multisystemic therapy? Okay. So this is one of the most well-researched evidence-based practices that's out there. And if we look at the states that are reporting, the percent of states that are reporting adopting evidence MST and implementing MST over time, we actually see a pretty interesting trend. We see a really nice, and it'd be curious, Keller's here in the room, if this matches your lived experience implementing MST. This is what the states were telling us. But we had a really nice, huge increase in the early 2000s, followed by a drop and then pretty flat over time. When we look at the budget allocations that states have for many things that are supportive of evidence-based practices, we see a pretty similar, increase and then followed by a pretty significant decrease starting in 2007. Now, of course, the Great Recession hit in 2007, and there's all sorts of reasons for it. But it brings me to wonder, what's happening out in the field, or why isn't the implementation of evidence-based practices keeping pace with what we're learning from the literature? And I'm just going to present one more slide on this paper because I'm really excited about this paper and what we found out about it. Because the other thing is thinking about children's evidence-based practices too. This story is even a little grimmer. So when we looked at 3 adult evidence-based practices, so assertive community treatment, supported employment, and supported housing. For assertive community treatment, we see an increase kind of over time, up and down a little bit. Supported employment, an increase over time. Supported housing, a decrease followed by, is that me? Followed by an increase and then a slight decrease. But you can see at the end of the day, somewhere around 75% of states are reporting using one or more of these. When we look at the children's one, here's treatment foster care, not too shabby. MST, you saw that in the previous graph, and functional family therapy. You could just see where the children's evidence-based practices separate out, and so it's an even more of a distinction, I think, between what's being done and what we know. So, does that surprise anybody? Yeah.
I've read this paper, and just to comment on, I think that the bump, at least on the MST side, is I think the uniform reporting system.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah, so he's referring to the line there. There's different reporting systems that were used prior to 2005 and 2007. So you kind of look at the data a little, you have to consider it a little bit differently.
So I think that bump I think it's mostly attributed to the fact that people were reporting in ways that were quite different.
Yeah, the downward trend. But then it's still, yeah, but then it's also still been flat.
Absolutely, we do that.
Yeah, right.
It's an interesting distinction there of the investment in, because we always think that investment in children is very high.
Yes.
And that's just sort of the context that most of us think, and that less investment, but obviously it's this distinction between what's investment in children versus investment.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. So we also decided it's not the field of dreams, right? It's not, if you build it, they will come. Having these programs out there is not enough. We have to be really thinking strategically about how we buck this trend now, right? How can we start having those trend lines move up as a country? And so this gets complicated fast. So this is where I wish that I had a hologram or a 3D printer or something. You have to kind of push these two pictures together. But we know our children, youth, and families are surrounded by many different systems that are tasked with their well-being. Each of those systems has many different layers and levels that are attached to them as well. So you have your practitioner, the person who is directly interacting with a family who needs to know how to deliver an intervention, but we have their supervisors, we have their organizational leadership, we know a lot about organizational climate and culture. And so when we kind of consider all of these things together, if we're looking at a comprehensive population level approach to increasing evidence-based practices, you start to see where it gets complicated quickly about where to go. Yeah?
Just to make it a little bit more complicated, you didn't put funders in.
I didn't. I know, absolutely. Thank you for that. So he said we didn't put funders in this circle either, which is a really critical piece. And to further complicate things, each of these systems comes in with some different considerations. And so one paper that I find particularly helpful that was written in 2012 by Byron Powell pulls together a lot of different I call them ingredients that could be helpful to inform implementation. And he characterizes them across things that you can do to be planful around your implementation, educational strategies, finance to get to your point as well, ways that you might have to restructure the system to support evidence-based practices, how you do quality management to keep them going over time, and then even some policy level changes that might be important to give the necessary pushes and pulls for the system to move forward with evidence-based practices as well. So in addition to the different systems and the different layers, now we have different strategies too. So in this next slide, I just threw up a few ideas, enough that would fit on the slide. And what I wanted to do is highlight a couple that are meaningful to me and then have you all reflect and tell me what other ones we could put on the slide if we had more room. But I wanted to just show some of the differences across systems that have to be considered. So some of the work that I do, I'll pick one on who delivers the evidence-based practice. We know that this is really important as we're planning our educational strategies and approaches. In the child welfare system, there's actually a lot of differences across the country about the extent to which child welfare professionals actually are in positions to deliver the intervention themselves versus they're in roles to facilitate the linkages to programs and services for families. So in Washington State, where I'm from, it's a facilitate the linkage state, right? They don't actually deliver the services themselves. And in Maryland, where we do work with the National Center, they can actually deliver the services. We could do some training with the social workers to teach them about evidence-based practices, and they can do something different in their interactions with children in the foster care system. And so that again just adds this extra layer of complexity too when we think about what are the different approaches. Another one I would like to give, I've been doing some work in pediatric primary care lately. And you talk to doctors just even about roles, and I think it's sort of consistent also with what I was just talking about with child welfare workers. But just some concern about the fit between what it takes to actually deliver some of these programs and the contextual realities that people live in their day-to-day environment. I don't know if any of you have kids, but have you ever had more than like 20 minutes with your doc? You know, it's a very rare event unless it's something very serious that you get much more than that. And so how do you give, if docs are going to be the people who are the deliverers of the intervention, which we know they're incredibly highly respected individuals in our communities, and the most part we would love for them to be delivering some pieces of information, how do we fit that into their context? And then some worry, because in med school and in residency, there's often very little training on mental health, and especially children's mental health, that extends beyond some of the medication stuff that's out there, so a real concern around Pandora's box.
You know, I would think, and you know, I have no data about this, that the PCPs, being scientists themselves, right, that's their education and everything, would really be receptive to the whole science aspect of evidence-based practice and the design, the randomized control trials, all of that.
In my experience, they're very receptive to the theory of it. And it's the implementation that gets challenging. Is there anyone who's a physician in the room that could speak from a firsthand experience? I've been doing a lot of training with physicians lately, and just that nervousness that if I ask what's going on, that I might get something that I'm not trained to handle, right? And that's the piece that's hard. And so how do you create training that increases confidence and self-efficacy? They're giving advice about parenting, for example. That's the area I do a lot of my research at. They give advice all the time about parenting. In fact, they say in about 80% of their visits, they say something about parenting. The extent to which it's an evidence-based kernel of wisdom probably varies pretty dramatically. Anything else you guys would add as you look at this? Other considerations? Yeah.
I think one thing that's come out too is, especially for children's mental health, is access to primary care or highly trained mental health professionals.
Yeah.
In rural areas, smaller towns, less well-funded states.
Yeah. The geographic considerations are huge, and some of the evidence-based practices that are designed to be delivered, for example, just in an office-based setting where you might have to have a one-way mirror and a whole setup, you know, to be able to deliver it, they've had to create some modifications to be able to deliver in a home-based setting or something where you can actually address some of the transportation needs and the distance and disparities, that kind of thing. Yes?
just overlaying the funding issue and where we are in the U.S., I think there have been and will continue to be really big shifts in the way Medicaid funding is
Yes,
used,
yeah.
especially for children's services. And the degree to which that derives the mental health practitioner
Yeah.
service layer through all the systems
Ooh.
as a primary funded
Absolutely.
of services is I think will
Things are going to
really
shift.
impact that who delivers
Yeah.
the PDPs.
I'm excited to share with you actually something really related to that in just a minute. I'll take one more. Yeah.
Well, I was just looking at the juvenile justice category, and I think one of our experiences here in Colorado, particularly working with the juvenile justice probation officer kind of category, has been really a resistance to evidence-based practice. I don't think that's overstated really, actually. It seems almost like there's another influence going on in their training.
Right.
That's contrary to adopting some of the
Yeah.
evidence-based practice.
So we have to understand that, right, and unpack that a little more. And I don't know that we totally know what that's all about quite yet. And so I think that's a really important point. Great. Okay. I said one last one, but go ahead, David. I can't say no to you.
Jeff, there he is. Jeff and I both work with a group in Colorado that is really looking at evidence-based practices in the juvenile justice system. And that state versus county dynamic in Colorado is so potent.
Yeah.
It's both anywhere,
Yeah.
everywhere.
And the fear of driving any change from
The
the
top,
top without
yep.
the support from the bottom.
Yeah.
A lot of the people on this committee say, that the state-driven initiatives are dead in the water.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just child welfare, that's.
Yeah, right. It could be, absolutely. And each state has different, I have some colleagues in California, and they talk about their counties as being these fiercely independent, practically owned countries, right? So anything that they want to institute in California, they have to, I think they have 40-some counties, or they have to go county by county by county, right, to kind of get that going. We have a little more luck in Washington because we're mostly state administered. But the dynamics are there. I shall stand very still. Okay, we could probably spend the rest of my hair. Okay, it's because I have two. I'm really well wired today. Okay, there we go. All right. So I'm going to move on to it because I want to tell you about a couple of examples of how we've used some of Powell's principles and a couple of stories that actually get to some of the things that you all already brought up as well. So the first example I want to share with you is an implementation project that we have been doing for a couple of years in Washington State. We got initial funding in 2012. I have some of my project partners listed up here. We do this in strong partnership with our state leaders, as well as with Triple P, which I'll tell you more about in a moment, but it is a proprietary company, so they're an evidence-based practice. So we make sure that we're working really closely with them as well, so we're not breaking any rules. So Triple P, are people familiar with the Positive Parenting Program? I see one hand. Few hands. Okay, but some people that aren't, so I'm just going to do this very light touch. I do have some references at the end of the slides if you're interested in more information about any of these programs. But Triple P is really unique in the parenting world because it's a multi-level system that's in place, and so the idea is that it meets a population health need. You can have many different services, light touch services available for many families, and more intensive level services available for families that need more. And so the idea is that almost all families would be have the advantage of media level campaigns and awareness and destigmatizing campaigns. Lighter touch would be things like being in your physician's office or talking with your Head Start teacher, or we've done some work in faith-based communities where it's a briefer interaction, 1 to maybe 4 half-hour interactions with a family, giving them some support. And then levels 4 and 5 look a little bit more like traditional parenting, 10 sessions, or level 5 might even be up to 15 sessions of special support for families. We got excited about the Triple P program I had actually delivered it as a practitioner for a few years, and I knew that it was really effective for a lot of the families that I worked with. But in 2009, Ron Prinz and his colleagues published a study where they did something called a place randomized trial, which is instead of flipping the coin and people get into a condition or not, they flip a coin and an entire county or an area, a jurisdiction gets placed into an intervention or not. And so they had 9 counties that were randomized to receive the PPP intervention and 9 counties that weren't. And in the 9 counties that did, they trained about 700 providers across those levels. And what they really found, they standardized it to a community that has 100,000 kids under the age of 8, that after 2 years, they felt pretty confident that they were able to move the needle on some pretty important child abuse and neglect indicators, including out-of-home placements, hospitalizations for intentional injuries, and child abuse. That's pretty awesome when you look at that and you think about return on investment and cost savings and those kinds of things. We thought that would be really neat to bring something like that to Washington. But there wasn't a lot of information and data in this study that guided implementation. And it's really hard to know how they actually were able to move the needle because of the way that the study was designed. They actually never talked with practitioners and never talked with families. So it was just looking at the impact on administrative level data. So it answered as many questions, or it brought us to more questions than it answered from an implementation standpoint, but also got us really excited about what this type of approach could do for a community. We also had just finished a study where we randomized pediatric residents to receive PPP training or not. And we found in that we were able to really nicely increase the doc's confidence in delivering parenting interventions. So this is our intervention group. Time 2 is where they got trained and our control group didn't. And then time 4 is where the control group got trained. And so, from a research standpoint, that's a pretty beautiful graph. That's like exactly what you want to see, right? So we got excited about that. But what we really got excited about is that we contacted families directly. And the families actually reported, those families that saw the physicians that were trained, and we actually didn't even ask them if they delivered PPP or not. They just got the had the information. They actually self-reported many fewer coercive parenting compared to those parents who saw residents that weren't trained. So we thought, here we have some real family level proof that having this knowledge in the hands of physicians can really also make a difference. So I got excited about that too. So the state funded our pilot project, which we called our demonstration project. We picked 3 communities in Washington. They're all very rural. Omak is actually not far from that initial picture I showed you where the fires were and everything. That community sits on the edge of one of the larger Native American reservations in Washington state. Othello, which is kind of more in the central eastern part of the state, also extremely rural. It was one of the first towns in Washington that flipped majority-minority. The Latino community there, I think, is at about 70%. And so we were really eager to see if how our implementation principles held up across different communities that had different cultural diversities. And then Ocean Beach, Washington is over here for any of you that were old fans of Kurt Cobain. This is right around where he was, where he grew up. So understandably, it's a fairly depressed area of Washington. Not a lot of people there tend to be pretty poor. There's not a lot of industry. And there's just a lot of needs. And these communities applied to be part of our project. They're all considered Prevention Redesign Initiative communities, meaning they're at really high risk. Kids are really high risk for substance abuse, teen pregnancy, school dropout, employment problems. And so what we wanted to look at with those communities is what's going on, like how can we look at the variability in implementation? We got community coordinators linked up with each of those communities that did the on-the-ground work, but we were kind of the wind beneath their wings in some ways. Just to kind of bring this back to the Powell paper, I highlighted in orange the different strategies that we used. And we, of course, you're not going to be able to do all of them, nor probably do you have the time to do all of them. But we actually touched a large number of them when I sat down and thought about this initiative and what we were able to do. Couple of examples of things. So facilitating financial support, and this kind of gets to what Keller was mentioning earlier, one of the things that we heard from our physicians is that we love this, but we only have so much time in our visits and we don't get paid to do this work. So we said, can we change that? Maybe we can actually get you paid to do this work. We worked with our state healthcare authority, which is the Medicaid group, and we actually were able to convince them that providing some financial incentives for the physicians to deliver this intervention would be important. So we got buy-in from them. That South Carolina study was incredibly helpful. We were really glad to have that because that built sort of the big picture of what this could do. We had to get buy-in regarding relevance. This is a prevention program at its heart, but the Medicaid really deals with diagnoses, right? And so we had to talk about, well, here are the potential diagnoses that are going to be impacted and do that kind of crosswalk work. And then we also had to get buy-in from them around the quality of care. There was a lot of concern that if we trained physicians in how to deliver this intervention, that when families had needs that were greater, that they wouldn't have access to those higher levels of services, and where's sort of the ethical line there? And so we really had to assure them that folks we were training were being trained within a system where there would be more intensive supports available. Here's a picture of what we did for these incentives. So Medicaid said, sure, we're going to do this, but we have to kind of ensure that the quality is going to be good. So all the practitioners have to receive accreditation. Once they're accredited, some magic happens over in Olympia where their provider number gets turned on to something. I don't know. I don't know exactly how all the mechanisms work, but they get approval to access these billing codes that previously had only been available for mental health providers to use. And so we came up with other codes also, so as they're entering the information, we can track it over time, we can see how much the billing is happening, and we're really excited about this evolution. To my knowledge, we're the first state in the country that kind of cracked this nut. We've been doing some consultation with some other states about the process that we use to do it, but we're really excited about it. Also in this project, I just wanted to show you the diversity of professions that we were able to touch. I'm sorry that you can't read the red one very easily. That says mental health, but you can see that we got a pretty nice slice of the pie of different folks that participated. But here's the thing, is implementation is hard, and evidence-based practices is hard, and we were kind of disappointed when we did our first 6-month follow-up that really only about half of the providers that we trained were doing it. Anybody else have had this experience? I see a kindred soul, and it's really, really bad news for an implementation effort, but it's actually really kind of good news for a research study, because then you can start to be like, okay, what are the explanatory variables? What are the things that help us understand why some of the people went on to adopt the program and some didn't? We actually have, I think, a group of folks in here that are really slow starters that ended up eventually doing the program, but it was after the 6 months. We wanted to see how do we get that immediate uptake. So some of the things that we found, and we had to use exact logistic regression for this. It's a very small sample size, so take all of this with a grain of salt, but it is a preliminary study. One of the biggest things that came out was practitioner self-confidence and their sense of efficacy when they walked out of the training event. It just showed up that for each unit of self-efficacy higher, they were 3 times more likely to be in that early adopter group. And that probably doesn't surprise anybody. It tends to make sense, but I think it also gives us a call to our education and our training groups in really thinking about how do we activate self-efficacy in training environments. You know, we don't activate self-efficacy by doing what I'm doing right now, is killing you with PowerPoint presentation, right? Like, you have to activate self-efficacy through live demonstrations and practices and people feeling like they have a sense of what the intervention's about. And so it's just sort of a call, I think, that we have to really think about how we address that issue in a training environment. We also found really nice odds ratios for the more favorable people walked in to the space. Thinking about evidence-based practices had a really big impact on whether or not they went on to deliver the practice as well. And we also found work people who worked in healthcare settings tended to be able to adopt it more easily. We think there was more continuity between, they didn't have to do as much adjusting to fit it into their setting. But some things that didn't have an impact, at least in this study, it didn't seem to matter how satisfied they were, although our satisfaction rates were pretty high, so there could have been a ceiling effect. It didn't seem to matter if they had any prior experience with parent consultation. It didn't seem to matter what was going on in the community. We hypothesized that referral pathways would be really important, that places that had strong referral pathways would be more quick to adopt. But there could be some issues with our communities and clustering, why that didn't show up. It didn't seem to matter. We did levels 2, 3, and 4 of triple P. It didn't seem to matter which level they got. That wasn't really impacting whether they adopted it more quickly or not. And then one thing that didn't impact how quickly they adopted it or not that I actually think was a good sign is that our Spanish language providing practitioners, they actually didn't seem to matter either. We had hypothesized that they might struggle a little bit more because the intervention was developed in English. It was presented, the training was in English, but they were providing it in Spanish, and there's just that, anytime you have to do a little translation, right, it creates a little bit of opportunity for people's self-confidence in what they're doing to shift a little bit, but we didn't see that. In fact, one of our very highest adopters is this wonderful woman who provides the intervention exclusively in Spanish. Even to Mixteco populations, which we have in Washington. I don't know if you have Mixteco population here in Colorado, but it's a dialect that is almost its own language separate from Spanish. And so they were even having to translate the translated material, and it still didn't seem to matter. So we were happy about that. Lessons, one final thing that we did find that I call this my all is not lost slide, is that it's kind of interesting when we look at doing these trainings, our providers, regardless of whether they were adopters or not adopters, they said that they took pieces of the training into their work life in other ways. And so almost all of them, I just put the averages up here, but it was a nice group of people that were even highly bringing in some of these things. But I wanted to point to one, using behavioral rehearsal and modeling. There's increasing research out there that this is a super effective tool in transfer of knowledge and skills for parents, and it's something that we know that practitioners often don't feel super confident doing in the room. And they told us that they are starting to do it more, even if they're not doing it in triple P. They've brought it into other areas of their work, and we know that that's aligned with best practice. So this is something I want to do a little bit more research on, is sort of what are the positive side effects, right, of some of these trainings that we do, and maybe it extends beyond just what we're able to measure in implementation. So I have a couple of lessons learned up here. I think our community coordinators played a huge role in the success, and we have started to look at variability and the community coordinators' confidence in different areas and trying to map that onto what we see from implementation standpoint. But we definitely learned it's not the field of dreams, but that there may be more than meets the eye, and that self-efficacy piece really seems pretty powerful, and one that we're really thinking about, not just what happens in the training room, but what happens in the rest of the implementation support system that's happening to make people feel really that they're gaining skills. So we're taking this show on the road. We have an urban initiative that we're doing right now. We just finished our first year of in Tacoma. And we're really intentionally doing some more work in the primary care realm, but we're also using something called a social network analysis to both look at what are some of the more ways that agencies and organizations support each other in this work. How does that predict uptake? And then also how does that shift and change over time? So I'm really excited about that part we've been able to build in. And we're going to build in some more client level outcomes, because that's going to really work, thinking back to the Powell presentation, how we get buy-in. If we can really demonstrate that the families are having a positive experience, that goes a long way with our state funders. I don't have a ton of time left to tell you about this other project, but I want to tell you some about it because it highlights a different system, so the child welfare system that we're working with. And it's a project that we call Creating Connections, and it's funded by the Administration for Children and Families. This project is part of a Many different states have funding. They're called trauma grants, including Colorado. We're in the second cohort, so we're just at the end of our third year right now of funding. Colorado is at the end of their fourth year of funding. And then there's another group that is just at the end of their third year of funding that just got funded. We have a paper under review right now, but there's a lot of talk out there right now about what is a trauma-informed system and what does it mean to be trauma-informed. And so we took a step back and we said it's got to be more than just education about trauma. That's an important piece of it, and you need to know about the impact of trauma, but we also need to know who is impacted by trauma, right? So trauma identification. And we need to know what to do about it when we see trauma, right? And symptoms of traumatic stress. And so, so we've had that as sort of a guiding framework for our work. And again, kind of bringing this back to the Powell paper, we've really haven't been able to do much in the realm of policy and quite as much in the realm of finance. We're starting to eke out a little bit with some financial supports around screening and that kind of thing. But we've really focused much more on our education and our restructuring and quality management efforts. So the whole purpose of this grant is to link children and youth in the foster care system with evidence-based practices, that they need to get connected better and more efficiently and that kind of thing. So we conceptualized 5 main kind of activities that would need to be underneath that. So the screening activities, so understanding what the mental health needs of the children are, having social workers who are able to take the results of that screening and understand it to make strategic case level decisions, that they are able to have referrals to mental health that are picked up by providers who are trained in these types of interventions, which gets us to the service array, having providers that are trained in the interventions available. And then we need to see how they're doing over time, because as you know, and kind of actually apropos to your fidelity point that you made, there are many people out there that say that they're doing this work, but we need to have some system in place to know that kids are actually getting better, because there is a lot of variability in the types of services that are out there. So we identified several different approaches. We embedded a trauma screening tool. So all children in care within the first 30 days of care receive a trauma symptom screen. We did some training. We partnered with our Child Welfare Academy. You told me the name of it earlier. The name here, I don't know what the equivalent is here, but in Washington State, it's the Alliance for Child Welfare Excellence, who train all of the incoming social workers that are working in child welfare. So we created some training for them because they needed to know what to do with the screening information. We used a gaps analysis to understand what services are available and where there's needs in communities so that people could make strategic referrals. And then we just instituted an ongoing mental health screening system so that every 6 months these children are getting rescreened between the ages of 3 and 17. They're getting rescreened so that we know how they're looking. And we're plugging that into something we're calling a decision tree analysis, where we're seeing how many kids are getting screened. Yes, they got screened, and no, they didn't. Yes, if they got screened, did they screen positive or not? Did they end up going to mental health services or not? Where are we missing people? Were you gonna?
I was just going to ask, is your screening tool both experience and symptomology based?
So no, it's actually just symptomatology based. We went back and forth about. So she asked, for those of you in the back, if it's trauma experiences and or symptomatology. We went with just symptomatology because we went back and forth with our stakeholders around whether we should ask about the trauma experiences, but decided for the social workers, really, and remember in our state they don't deliver direct services, right? We just need to know if the child was suffering, right, to link them up, and that the mental health provider would be the one who would ask then the list of different things that might have happened so that they can do that in a therapeutic way and whatnot. But other states are doing it with actual events as well, and they're learning a lot. So I think there's a lot of strengths in doing that.
I mean, my curiosity was because you're talking kids in foster care that in a 6-month period, several other traumatic experiences
Could have happened, yeah.
And knowing that's
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So this is just a picture of a training that we had. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of the details because what I really want to show you are a couple of graphs, and I think I can do that without talking to you about all the details on this slide. This is a trimodal distribution. It's pretty amazing how you can see we had a group of people who loved our trauma tool. We had a group of people who were sort of okay with it, they were moderate, and then we had a group of people who were very loud and vocal who were not so happy with it. Getting this type of information from training is so important. If we would have just looked at the averages of everybody, we would have missed this distribution entirely. And if we would have just listened to people in the room, we would have thought everybody was down here actually too. That's the other thing, right? So we were able to see that we have some champions. We have some people that are totally on board with it. People in the middle, we're not too worried about them. They're on the fence, but we'll take it. But we really had to think about some strategies to support implementation to get these folks. Now, we were mandating that they had to deliver these tools. They had to administer the tools. They couldn't get out of it. We wanted to see how we could help them to be more satisfied with it. Also, check this one out. This is a bimodal distribution, but their comfort with using the tool, too. You can see we had a big pool of people that were really pretty confident about it, and then a big pool of people that were still feeling very reticent. There's probably a relationship also with their perceptions from the slide before, too. Yeah, yeah, pretty much. I mean, there's a little. People moved just a teeny bit because some people hated it but felt it. Sorry, but felt good about it. Other people liked it but weren't confident in screening. But by and large, they're pretty similar. Yeah. So we ended up. One of the program managers ended up doing a total roadshow all over Washington State. Had to visit all of the offices, sit down and have individualized conversations with folks. Our experience now is that this has shifted dramatically in a positive direction at this point. We're actually just, I think next week, doing another survey of folks to see if we've been able to move the needle on it. But this is just a plug for collecting this type of data and really looking at it to inform the technical assistance that you might provide to support implementation over time. And then I'll just show you one other thing. This is my partner in crime and I doing a training. But we partnered with our Child Welfare Academy to deliver trainings to social workers about how to use the programs. And this is just one last piece I wanted to share with you because we were really excited about these findings as well. We were able to see really dramatic improvements in social workers' confidence and express preparedness to address the mental health needs for children and youth in the child welfare system over the course of our training. We had 2 different trainings. We had a 3-hour training and a full day training. They had to go through the 3-hour training within the first couple months of being hired. And then the all-day training is within the first year of being on the job. So not only were we excited that we saw improvements across the pre to post training, we also divided out our groups with those folks who had previously been in the mental health system, right? So they had worked as therapists or otherwise exposed to the mental health system, and also people who had more or less experience in child welfare but were just transitioning over to a different role. And we saw an interaction effect there where, of course, as you might predict, those people with less experience in child welfare or who were not previously in the mental health system were saying that they were less confident coming into the training. But their slopes are actually quite a bit larger, and they don't look that different than the folks that were more experienced and had mental health training previously at the end. So that helped us to know that we kind of hit the mark with our training and giving them just the type of information that they needed to know to be able to do their jobs effectively at the level that they needed to. They also rated the training really highly, which we were excited about. And we saw that same trend across both the in-service and the regional core training, the 3-hour versus the 1 day. So just to kind of summarize that project as well, we really looked there at a range of different strategies to bring evidence-based practices to the forefront of availability for children and youth. Because of where we are in the project, our next steps are really to look at and see how that linkage happens, that decision tree piece that I was talking about, and see how we're doing with these sort of supportive or facilitative factors and being able to get children and youth into care. But really the thing to highlight is to see is evaluate your trainings and don't just look at the means. Really think about what are the different types of experiences different folks are having, and are there ways that we can tailor our trainings differently to different folks over time to get change. So I'll just kind of end by reflecting on some of hopefully you saw some examples of how we've been able to tackle some of the active ingredients that Byron Powell and his colleagues purport are important for implementation of evidence-based practices. We've talked about several different systems in which we've looked at those practices over time, and a few results that we've been able to get from these really very developmental projects that are in place. So I'll conclude there and pause for questions.